So, welcome to the Adventures in Learning podcast. For my regular listeners, you know that I tend to focus on early childhood and elementary stories. Often there's a science or a STEM component. But when this book came across my desk, I knew we had to talk to the author. Um, I got the second installment, which is just out, Threat of the Spider from the Web of the Spider series. And I couldn't put it down. I read it and I read it and I stopped and then I read some more. And it's so relevant to where we are today that I am so excited to introduce you to the author, Michael Spradlin, and be able to talk to you about why we need to study history and how important these books are, but also just how freaking well written this is. So, Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for those kind words. I'll be sure to share them with my editor.
Well, please do. So, Michael, I know I picked up the second book in the series because this one is coming out right now.
in June.
Um, and it's so powerful. It starts before World War II happens. So it's in that time, that space in between that we don't learn about in school.
Right.
The time between World War I and World War II. And I know that as I was reading, I missed the first book. And so I went back and reread the first book later and realized this stands alone beautifully without needing to have read the first book, but they certainly play well on each other. Can you tell us about the series and sort of what inspired you to write this?
Yes, I do think it works well together. The plan for the series is for it to cover the years 1929 until 1934, when Hitler, after the chancellor dies and Hitler is named Chancellor of Germany. Um, we also wanted to do each book from a different point of view, from a different character, which is something that we started, obviously in book two. Some of the characters will be Jewish, some are not. But all of them have this rather deep distaste for what they see happening to their country. And the idea for this kind of resistance focused story came to me. I was talking to an editor, and I had really wanted to write for some time a book about the Edelweiss Pirates. And for those who don't know, they were a group of children, basically, actually during the war in the late 1940s, who were opposed to the Hitler regime, engaged in acts of espionage, propaganda. Some were caught and executed at 12, 13, 14 years old. And I just found that to be fascinating, and was going to write about that. And when this conversation, it became this wide-ranging conversation about the history of that place, and if these kids in World War II, and when their country is, everything is falling on top of them, they don't have anything to eat. Where did that indomitable spirit come from? It had to come from somewhere, and it came from their older brothers and sisters and cousins who watched what happened. And I think it's important to note for the record that not everyone in Germany was a Nazi or supported
Right.
the Nazis. I mean, that's really important. They took, a lot of people think that Hitler just took power overnight, and that's not the case at all. I mean, when you get to 1934, when he is actually finally named chancellor, and he abolishes every other political party, kills all his political enemies, it looks like he's taken power overnight. But it was a long slog of 10 to 15 years of parliamentary elections, and gaining seats, losing seats, and gaining seats, and until he finally was able to take over. And so that to me is like the amount of time that you know, to these kids that are experiencing it at age 12, 13, uh, it seems like forever. But eventually it's not going to seem like forever. I mean, at the age they're at now, it's like 1/10 of their life, what they've been through in the last year. But anyway, it's just an important distinction, I think, to make.
Well, and I think as I was reading, I found so many of the things they were going through in pre-World War II Germany very parallel to what our society feels like it's experiencing today,
Sure.
from, the upheaval in the stock market, the depression, the rise of totalitarianism, there were many points that I stopped and shivered a little bit as I look at our headlines and look at what was going on in Germany. And I realized you didn't write this year.
No,
You clearly were writing before we hit
correct.
2025. And so, as a historian, I'm assuming you've noted the parallels, and I'm wondering sort of what your take is on that.
Oh, for sure. There's certainly many parallels to what's happening, and in some ways, I found it kind of odd that there was an analogous comparison of the United States during the Great Depression and Germany in terms of, both countries were economically flat on their backs. The situation was actually, believe it or not, was much worse in Germany. You had 50% or more unemployment. You had, banks failing one right after the other. No jobs, no hope of jobs. And and having come out of World War One, the Great War, and having been um, so punitively treated, they felt, whether we can
Right.
argue that till the cars come home, but they felt unfairly treated. They felt that they were blamed for many of the things in the Great War, and were forced to being paid for many of the things in the Great War that they were not responsible for. So that led to this bitterness and resentment. And when you start working on a project like this, you say, okay, I'm going to go to 1929. Well, I got to go back to the Great War because some of what's happening now. And I remember reading about the Treaty of Versailles Commission. John Maynard Keynes, the Nobel Prize winning economist, was on the committee for Britain, and he resigned because he said this treaty is not a treaty; it's a 20-year ceasefire, and almost 20 years to the day, almost.
Wow.
It started back up again, and so it's just this stuff that you find that you come to understand that a lot of it, in some form or another, has happened before, and it will happen probably again. Unfortunately, we tend to have to do things 10 or 12 times before we we get the sense not to do them anymore. You know,
Right.
but it is. I think I've always felt that historical fiction was a great way to get kids involved in something. I think in some of the novels that I've written prior to this, the best thing I get is when I get the letters or the emails like, well, I read your book about the USS Indianapolis, and then I went to the library and I got a bunch more books about it. And then I got really interested in it. And then I did a report on it for school. And then my dad had me take it to the Rotary Club for one, I mean, it's just one little push,
It's that spark.
it just rolls downhill. And that to me, and I've always felt that's a great historical fiction is a great way and this in particular, because this series is set in a time with a lot of things happening that really are not easy to break down. I mean,
Right.
there's a lot of socioeconomic, political, economic, you name it, and to try to break that down to a middle grade audience without a lot of exposition or a lot of throwaway dialogue is a challenge, but it's hopefully it's working so far.
Well, and I was talking to Lori Hall Sanderson a couple of weeks ago for the podcast, and she was talking about how she doesn't like the term historical fiction. She'd far rather have people talk about it as historical adventure, because she's like, I do all the research, but just like a fantasy novel, we're world building and we're creating these incredible worlds. They just happen to be grounded in fact. And I was thinking, you created this village where I felt like I could walk down the street and I could find the burned out shop where his father starts to run the local newspaper, or where they were playing capture the flag. Like all of that was really vivid to me.
Right.
Where did you go to sort of do your research? Did you
Well,
go to Germany? How did you put this together to build your world?
I did. I spent time in Nuremberg and in Harrodsburg. I'm not ashamed to say I've become obsessed with Harrodsburg. It is just like the most beautiful, quaint Bavarian town that you could. I mean, it's just absolutely stunningly gorgeous. And every time you turn around, you think you're going to see Cinderella's castle popping up on a hill somewhere. And it just is in this area that's just, like I said, it takes your breath away when you look in any direction. And so I sent, my wife went with me, and we spent time there, and I walked all over the place. I walked to the field where the capture flag game takes place, the creek, which I knew because I knew these are. Oh, you also have to remember that these are 12-year-olds, so they're going to be playing ice hockey, and they're going to be playing, capture the flag and all these other things while this, life goes on around them. But it was just a real, and it was, in some cases it was a first for me, because with a lot of the stuff that I've written before, historical adventure, um, is that world doesn't exist anymore. So to try to go visit it,
Right.
doesn't really give you what you're looking for. Harrodsburg had been preserved, not damaged too much at all. Nuremberg had been extensively bombed, but the city fathers built the old city back the way it was before the war. So it still looks like a medieval city. And so I was able to, and I do think it had a really profound impact on me to be able to do that, because I felt like you just said, like, well, over here is where Mrs. Huffnagel kept her, apple fritter stand, and over there's the tailor shop, and I mean, I've never had something like that before, and I think it really paid dividends.
And you started with Rolf's story. This one tells Ansel's story. Um, where is the series going from here?
Series will go on to, in book 3, it will be Joshua's story. Joshua is kind of Ralph and Ansel's sidekick right now. And he will also be the first Jewish character in the series. Um, and then in book 4, it will be, which I'm working on right now. It will be twins Moritz and Matilda Leibowitz, the bookstore owner.
Oh, I'm so glad we get to see more of Matilda.
Yeah, I love Matilda, and
I do too.
she's going to. Her parents are communists, so part of their story is going to take place before they come to Harrodsburg, when they're living in the Soviet Union and the Ukraine in a collective farm, and trying to during the Holodomor famine, and trying to survive, and then she gets to um, Harrodsburg, and she thinks, oh my God, what a breath of fresh air. And then the next thing you know, here come the Nazis.
Right.
So it's going to be, and then after that, it will be, there'll be another two characters that we haven't met yet. Avram, who is the son of the local rabbi, and the other one I haven't come up with a name for yet, but it will be, there'll be, like I said, there'll be more Jewish characters. There'll be uh, trying to get, all the viewpoints in here that I can. And so far, I mean, that's the plan. I don't know. I'm not sure if any of them will be able to top Ansel in my book, but
I was going to say, Ansel is really quite the character. And I loved his unassailable facts, his
yes,
rules for living. How did you come up with those?
I need to start paying better attention to that kind of stuff, because I knew I wanted him to be quirky and, a little bit of a gadfly. And I think what I was doing, I was just Googling like dumb proverbs or something like that, like old proverbs that don't make any sense or
Right.
sound some. And then I said, oh, that's funny, but I can make these up now. So there's a mix. There's some that are like supposedly old Polish proverbs, and some are just stuff that I I said, okay, that sounds like Ansel, and it is something that, I mean, it's, uh, somebody asked me in it about, bringing some levity to the story and using those, his little facts, which right now, as you know from book two, like Ralph and Joshua just skip right over. I mean, they just don't, yeah, what,
Yep.
sure. And but for him, I mean, it keeps him sane. It keeps him he's watching the world spin out of control. And so if you want to anger the common wall glider, keep throwing it peanuts. I mean, that's something that he can hold on to. And like I said, and it does bring some levity to a situation where in a time and a place where I think humor was in short supply, unfortunately.
Right. Well, and I found myself thinking, I said at the beginning this was so well written. You made these characters compelling. And I mean, even the characters that play a minor role in this one, but will play a bigger role in the future. I mean, clearly I would have great affection for Matilda.
Right.
But what I found myself thinking is because you're writing in a specific point in history, we know how we sort of know how some of these stories end, or we can guess. How does that impact your relationship with the characters? You're writing in this period of time when they're 12, but it's
I think, and again, anything that I say here cannot be held against me because
understood, of course.
with 3 books to go, and so something may change. I don't know. But at the beginning of this whole process, I think there will be a prologue of what happened up to the war, to each of the characters, and after the final book, and then after, and this is the only time this has ever happened to me. It's never happened to me before, where I saw the last scene and the ending with the last character on the page. I said, that's how it's going to end.
Wow.
And I've
I've got chills.
never had that happen before because I don't usually know how it's going to end. Exactly. I mean, precisely. I know how it's going to sort of end, but I'm much more a fan of letting the characters do the heavy lifting and do the work because they're usually a lot smarter than me, that way. But I all along the way, I knew that this is, and I knew that when we first talked about it, I said, there's going to have to be some type of resolution, because this will end almost, 8 years before the war starts.
Right.
And I said, that's a long time. And by then, these are going to be 20 somethings, that are, and some of them are going to be fighting. Some of them are going to be, and I know right now that you've got to promise me that I can do a prologue because I don't want to get all the emails and angry letters.
You don't want the calls
I
from me
need to know
going,
what happened to
what
Rome.
happened?
You need to fix that. So, um, but and it's so funny. Kids just get so indignant because you probably haven't noticed yet, but I'm a big user and believer in the cliffhanger, in a novel, especially if it's in a series.
Yes.
And I always go to schools and that is usually about the first 5 or 10 minutes is being berated for using cliffhangers in my books. Like, why do you do that? Hey, I want to know what's going right now. And I'm like, okay, and I'll say, did you read The Youngest Templar, Keeper of the Grail? Well, yes. I said, and it ends he's in a shipwreck and you don't know if he's going to survive or not. So what did you do when the second book came out? Well, I went to the library and I got it and I read it.
You're like, bingo.
Ding, 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 ding. You win some lovely parting gifts.
So when they come at you for the ending of Thread of the Spider, you'll tell them they have to wait for the next book.
Right, exactly. Yeah, or the next something. Yeah, I don't know. But that was like really kind of at the forefront of my mind was that there is such, I consider, and one of the reasons somebody asked me, what interests you in World War II and World War II history, and I think there's a couple of reasons. Number one, my dad was a vet. and I grew up in a really small town in Michigan, and so every man in that small town that was my dad's age was also a vet. I mean, everybody, and that is it was like this thing, this
Right.
part of life, the war. Everybody would talk about, well, during the war, during the war, during the war, and it just held this fascination for me. And then starting to study it, I found that there was that, and then I also think that, and I truly do believe this, and I don't want to get into whataboutisms or anything like that, but I do think it is thus far it's the most transformative event in human history. I think you look at what everything that happened, not only geopolitically, what happened afterwards with the Cold War, but you look at even it was the United States Armed Forces that sparked the beginning of desegregation in this country. All these things, women in the workforce, um, all these things that cascaded from that singular event, and we still live on, their what they paid, 80 years ago.
Right.
And I just don't think there are too many things in human history that you can say that about. Um, and so to me, it's like there's just so many stories and so many great stories, and my previous novels, all tell, you mentioned, historical adventure. They're all based on true stories.
Right.
Prisoner of War is based on the life of America's youngest POW in World War II. These are all based on things that happened to real people. And like I said, I did all the research and all the investigating, and then I made some of it up, to tell the story. And it's not a PhD thesis. It's not, anything like that. But I hope that, like I said, it seems to be getting kids interested in these things and learning more. And that's what when I talk at schools, I'm always, you got to read more. You got to read more. You have to read more.
Right. And we're at a time in our history where there seems to be interest in erasing our history rather than in
Race.
digging deeper, like you're trying to encourage kids to do. What would you say to educators and families who are trying to work against that tide?
Well, the first thing I would say is to people out there that are, you know, trying to censor things and to ban books and all those things is I think that whole ecosphere could be helped a lot by just taking a deep breath. Just take a deep breath, step back a minute. It's a book. It's not some insidious, thing that's, and I point to my own experience with my own mother. When my much older sister was in, I think, seventh grade, there was a new social studies teacher that came to our school. And this was okay, so this was the 60s. So he was kind of a hippie, and had all these new ideas and new thoughts and stuff like that. And and my mom was not, but he wanted the class to read A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which I don't know if you've ever read it, but it's just an incredibly dark book about being put in a gulag in the Soviet Union and all this horrible. I mean, it's horrible. I mean, it's a great piece of writing, and I feel better and richer as a human being for having read it. But man, it is dark. And my mom went to the teacher and said, "You know what? I don't think my daughter's ready to read this yet. I don't think she has quite the grasp on these events or the emotional maturity yet to handle some of these things." And I'm hoping that we can find some other book for her to read that would, accomplish the same purpose, but not, if the other kids want to read it, that's fine. If their parents are okay with it, that's fine. I just want to advocate for her a little bit and, do my job as a parent. Uh, and and he was like, "Yeah, fine, that's fine." And I don't remember what she read, but she read something else. And I'm like, be like my mom.
Right.
I mean, no one's saying that you can't advocate for your child.
Right.
Certainly can, but you can't advocate for everyone else's child. That's
Exactly.
pitch. And you know, I it's I don't like this joke anymore, but because I used to joke about it all the time, and but now it's getting to be it's almost too serious to even joke about. But I said, you know, every time banned books weeks would come up, I write an essay and say, what do I have to do to get my books banned? Because you know, I mean, come on, people, help brother out, would you? And you know, and that's nothing like that has happened. I've gotten some weird letters and some concerned letters from parents and stuff like that, but nothing has ever happened to me like that. And I can't imagine what it must feel like to see um, people. I don't know. I mean,
I
I'm
think often we don't
in
read
the
the
West,
book.
and we try to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. Okay,
Right.
it's like,
No, but sometimes I feel like, at least as I've been following it, the people requesting the bans haven't read the books.
right,
And
exactly.
so it's a knee-jerk reaction
Yeah,
rather. So it's not even advocating for your own child at that point because you don't know what you're advocating for.
right. And we had a Harry Potter thing many years ago in the town where I live. And then it was finally put to rest by a brilliant response to a letter that some concerned parent had written about witchcraft and all that. And the person wrote, what's being left out here is that these books, 600, 800, 1,000 pages, are inspiring kids to read. And, you know, read them again and again in another book, a book like it. And so here's my suggestion. Let's leave the books on the shelf. And if any kid at the school manages to turn a teacher into a toad, we'll remove them.
That's brilliant.
And it all died right there, just like right there.
Oh my gosh, that's
I think everybody
absolutely
can finally
brilliant.
step back and say, okay, we're being kind of ridiculous here, you know. But it is a thing that I think, um, you know, like I want you to be able to stand up for your child and stand up for your faith and stand up for everything. But I don't need you to stand up for me.
Right.
You know, I can or my kid. You know, I can do that on my own.
No, that
Um,
makes a lot of sense.
because that's my job. And uh, you know, that I don't know. I feel like it just like you just said though, I feel like so much of this is getting done and nobody has any idea what it is they're doing or talking about, or you know, they not to get into too political, but you know, they do this all the time on both sides. But they had protesters, some anti-Jewish protesters at a college that were chanting from the river to the sea. And a reporter went up and asked this couple, you know, do you know which river this is referring to? No. Do you know which sea this is referring to? No. Just to the river to the sea, that's all you know? Yep. I mean, they don't have any idea what they're even.
Right. Well, and you were saying before we got on the official call that you're sort of the official, you're the historian in your family. You're the official fact checker.
Yeah.
Um, I've got to imagine you're putting your skills to work a lot
Yeah,
these days.
it is a lot. And
Guide us through how to do that because I feel like
yeah,
we all need a crash course in how to do fact checking.
right. And it is, you know, there are all these things that people could find out with a 5-minute Google search. You know, they go on and on about, you know, well, this administration this and this administration that. And I'm like, go back and read about the presidency of John Tyler, where he was forced to resign from both parties and his entire cabinet resigned and he was burned in effigy on the White House steps. That's pretty bad. You know, things are pretty bad when that happens. You know, we've had I did a book called Close Calls, a nonfiction book, which was just a kind of a fun book about presidents that had faced these life and death situations before, either in wartime or some other time. And you know, in the Capitol building, in the White House, we've had gunfights, we've had bombings, we've had, I mean, it's just has happened and happened over and over and over and over again. And in a free society, it's going to continue to. That's just part of it. And it's I don't know. I guess if people ask me, well, aren't you concerned about what's going on? I'm like, no, it's not it. Not that I'm not concerned, but I would say sometimes I'm a little bemused because we've seen this before. And somehow we find our way through it, and I just I'm gonna go down believing that. That's the hill I'm gonna die on.
What's the
That
pathway for finding our way through? How have they done it in the past?
Take a breath, step back, cool the rhetoric, realize that not everybody that is different than you is your enemy. Um, that people want different things, need different things. My dad had an expression with me and my sisters about minding each other's yard when we'd be like, I'd be getting in my sister's agitating her or something. He'd be like, mind your own yard. And he'd say it to them too, like you two mind your own yard. And and of course I used it on my kids. And that's it. We have to raise our families, ourselves, our children to be good, thoughtful citizens. And I truly believe that the American spirit will shine through that and that we will become better than we are. At least that's what I hope.
Well, and I think I would add to that maybe the other missing piece is reading stories about people and experiences, reading widely stories
Right.
about people and experiences that are different than you as well to build your empathy muscles so that you have compassion for people in other situations.
If I could just tell you one thing,
Yes.
my son and my dad was at Bastogne at the Battle of the Bulge, and I always wanted to go see it. So my son, a few years ago, he took me to Normandy, where my uncle was killed on Omaha Beach on June 6th. And then we went on by train to Bastogne. And there's a cafe there called the Nuts Cafe, which is when the American army was surrounded by the Germans sent a surrender demand, and the American commander sent back a one-word reply, which was nuts. And that, anyway, they have these flags in this cafe. One is of the United States and one is the 101st Airborne Division regimental flag. And people that have come through there for the last 80 years have pinned dollar bills to these flags with the name of their loved one written on the dollar bill, whoever was at the Battle of the Bulge or, in the army at that time. And my dad came right into the tail end. And I asked the bartender if I could borrow a pen if it was okay. And he said, oh, absolutely. And I went over, I had my back to the tavern, to the pub, and I was pinning it up. And when I pinned it up and turned it around, the entire pub stood and applauded. Now, talk about a gut punch.
Yeah.
I mean, because they know they
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 lived through it.
you know, and we don't. We really don't know how lucky we are in this country. We really do not. And to have them do that, I'm just some guy, my dad was a sergeant in the artillery. I mean, and here they stood up and applauded, because they understood that it was liberation and it was sacrifice. And they still understand it to this day. That American commander I was telling you about, they have a statue, they have his portrait on the city hall, they have General McAuliffe action figures that they it's like so I mean it's just I think those stories, like you said, I think they're just waiting to be told. And I know that from the, listening to kids and talking to kids, and I was just in 3 schools in Chicago last week, and I mean they're ready for these stories and they want them desperately. We just have to figure out a way to get them to them.
Exactly.
Always the
So
goal.
I'm going to take you back to Thread of the Spider to close.
Okay.
If there's one thing you hope that those kids who are hungry for the stories get from this series, what would it be?
Um, I think it goes back to about I get asked all the time about theme. What is the theme that runs through your books? What is this book's theme? What is that book's theme? And honestly, while I'm writing or thinking about it, I don't really think about theme too much. I don't like,
Right.
not like, oh, Great Gatsby, here, I'm going to put a yellow light at the end of the dock. Well, that's Daisy. Uh, you know,
You're
um,
telling a good story.
right, exactly. I hope. But I was at a conference once and a student, like 10, 11 years old, asked me, what's the theme of your books? And I said, "Yeah," and I was new to writing then. And I said, I honestly, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that because I don't think about it. And this librarian, very sweet little librarian, she stood up and she said, "Oh, balderdash." She actually said balderdash. She said, "Your books are about friendship and the importance of friendship and what friendship means to us as people." And I was like, okay, that works. And, and when I start looking at it in especially in my novels, but in all of my novels, there is that theme. So it's all families that we've chosen, not necessarily the ones that we were given. And I think that family and friendship and how much pressure do we allow the outside world, to condense that unit before it starts to crack, or will we ever let it crack? I have a feeling. I don't, like I said, I don't know what's going to happen all the way, but I have a feeling like Ansel's not the giving in type.
I get that feeling from this book.
Yeah, I don't think he's going to be capitulating to too much here in the near future. But so it's that. I think it's like, what are these themes of togetherness and friendship and love that we have for one another that carry through these stories? And I thought, you know what, I don't know if that librarian was right, but I'm going to go with that.
I think it's a great thing to go with. And
It sounds better than anything I could come up with. So,
I'm thrilled to have read Thread of the Spider. I can't wait for the next one in the series. But in the meantime, if you haven't started the series yet, it's not too late. You can jump in right now, just like I did, or grab the first one. But I highly recommend you get in on this series. Thank you for joining us today.
I appreciate it very much. Love to come back sometime.
Absolutely. We'll have you back to talk more.